The rain came down hard that night in Busan. It was the kind of rain that soaked through everything. The kind that made people stay home and order food instead of going out. For most delivery drivers, this meant more work and more tips. But for 17-year-old Junho, it just meant more cold and more wet clothes. He sat on his old scooter outside the restaurant, waiting for the next order. His helmet was cracked on one side, and his delivery bag had a small hole in the corner that he had patched with tape 3 times already. The tape was peeling again. He made a mental note to fix it when he got home. If he could find more tape. His phone buzzed. Another order. He looked at the address and felt his stomach drop a little. It was in Haeundae, the rich part of the city where the buildings touched the sky and the cars cost more than his grandmother's apartment. He didn't like going there. The security guards always looked at him like he was something they needed to clean off their shoes. The residents rarely tipped, and the elevators were so fancy that he was always afraid to touch the buttons with his wet fingers. But an order was an order. He needed the money. Junho started his scooter and drove through the rain. The streets were mostly empty, just a few taxis and buses moving through the water like slow fish. He thought about his grandmother waiting at home. She would have made rice and maybe some soup with whatever vegetables she could find on sale. She always waited for him to eat, no matter how late he came back. He told her many times not to wait, to eat and go to sleep, but she never listened. She said, "Food tastes better when you share it with someone you love." He thought about how tired she looked lately. Her hands shook more than they used to. Her cough was getting worse. He wanted to take her to a good doctor, not the free clinic where they waited for hours and the doctors barely looked at them. But good doctors cost money. Everything good cost money. The building appeared through the rain like something from a movie. It was all glass and light, stretching up so high that Junho couldn't see the top through the rain. He parked his scooter in the back where delivery drivers were supposed to park, away from the expensive cars in the front. A security guard watched him walk to the service entrance. The guard didn't say anything, but his eyes said everything. Junho took the service elevator to the penthouse floor. The elevator was plain and gray. Nothing like the golden one he glimpsed in the main lobby. But it worked, and it took him up 42 floors in less than a minute. His ears popped from the pressure. When the doors opened, he could hear music and laughter. Not recorded music, but the sound of people talking and glasses clinking. A party. He had delivered to parties before. Rich people love to order food for their gatherings, expensive dishes that cost more than Junho made in a week. They usually had someone waiting at the door to take the food so the delivery person wouldn't have to come inside. Junho preferred it that way, but tonight was different. He rang the doorbell and waited. No one came. He rang again. Still nothing. The noise from inside was loud, and he figured no one could hear the bell. He tried knocking. His wet knuckles made a soft sound against the heavy wooden door. Finally, the door opened. A woman in a black dress and high heels looked at him with confusion, like she couldn't understand why a wet teenager in a delivery uniform would be standing at the door of a penthouse party. "Food delivery," Junho said, holding up the bag. "Oh," she said. "Just bring it inside. The kitchen is somewhere over there." She waved her hand vaguely toward the inside of the apartment and walked away, already forgetting about him. Junho hesitated. He wasn't supposed to go inside. The rules said to hand off the delivery at the door and leave. But the woman was gone, and he couldn't just stand there holding the food. It would get cold. The customer might complain. He might lose this job. And he couldn't afford to lose this job. He stepped inside. The apartment was bigger than any place Junho had ever been. The living room alone was larger than his entire home. The ceiling was high, with lights that looked like floating crystals. The floor was some kind of dark wood that probably cost more per square foot than a month of his grandmother's medicine. Everywhere he looked, there were expensive things. Paintings on the walls, sculptures on tables. A view of the city through windows that stretched from floor to ceiling, and people. So many people. Men in suits that fit them perfectly. Women in dresses that sparkled when they moved. They held glasses of wine and champagne. They laughed at jokes Junho couldn't hear. They looked happy in a way that seemed effortless, like happiness was something they had always known and never had to fight for. No one noticed him. He was invisible, just another part of the service, like the waiters carrying trays or the bartender mixing drinks. He kept his head down and moved toward where he thought the kitchen might be. That's when he saw it. In the corner of the living room, near the big windows, there was a piano. But not just any piano. Junho stopped walking. He stopped breathing. His heart did something strange in his chest, like it was remembering something his mind had tried to forget. It was a Steinway. A grand piano, black and shining, its lid open like a bird spreading its wings. Even from across the room, Junho could tell it was old and valuable. The kind of piano that belonged in concert halls, not living rooms. The kind of piano that masters played, that made music so beautiful it could make people cry. He knew this piano. Not this exact one, but this type. He knew how the keys would feel under his fingers, smooth and heavy, and responsive. He knew how the sound would fill a room, rich and deep and alive. He knew because once, a long time ago, in a life that felt like it belonged to someone else, he had played pianos like this one. Memories came flooding back. His mother's hands guiding his small fingers across the keys. His father's face, proud and smiling, at his first recital. The academy in Seoul, with its practice rooms and strict teachers and endless hours of scales and arpeggios. The competitions, the applause, the feeling of music flowing through him like electricity. And then the accident, the phone call that changed everything. The funeral where he couldn't cry because he had to be strong for his grandmother. The move to Busan, to the tiny apartment, to the new school where no one knew he used to be special. The years of silence, of pretending that part of his life never existed, of practicing on paper keys taped to his desk because he couldn't afford a real instrument. 5 years. It had been 5 years since he touched a real piano. Junho realized he was still standing in the middle of the party, staring at the piano like a fool. A waiter bumped into him and muttered something annoyed. The food in his bag was getting cold. He needed to find the kitchen, drop off the delivery, and leave. That was his job. That was his life now. But his feet wouldn't move. His eyes wouldn't look away from the piano. Something inside him, something he thought was dead and buried, was waking up. It was hungry. It was desperate. It was screaming at him to walk over to that piano and play, to feel the keys under his fingers one more time, to remember who he used to be before the world took everything away. A loud voice cut through the noise of the party. A man was speaking, and people were gathering around the piano. Junho finally moved, but not toward the kitchen. He moved closer to the crowd, close enough to hear what was happening, still holding his delivery bag like it could protect him from whatever came next. He had no idea that in the next few minutes, his entire life was about to change. The man standing by the piano was tall and confident. He wore a gray suit that probably cost more than Junho would make in a year of deliveries. His hair was slicked back, his watch was gold. And when he smiled, everyone around him smiled too. This was clearly his apartment, his party, his world. Everyone else was just visiting. His name was Park Seung-ho, and Junho would later learn that he owned half the shopping malls in Busan and had business connections that stretched all the way to Seoul and beyond. But right now, all Junho knew was that this man commanded attention, like a king commands his court. "My friends," Park Seung-ho announced, his voice cutting through the chatter, "I want to show you something special tonight." He placed his hand on the piano like it was a trophy he had just won. The guests gathered closer, drinks in hand, curious expressions on their faces. "This," he continued, "is a 1923 Steinway Model D, one of only 50 ever made in that year. It was played by legends. It has been in private collections for almost 100 years. And now, it is mine. The crowd made impressed sounds. Some clapped politely. A few took out their phones to take pictures. I had it shipped from Vienna last month, Park Seung-ho said proudly. The shipping alone cost more than most apartments in this city. But for something this beautiful, this historic, no price is too high. An older woman in a red dress laughed and said, "But, Seung-ho, can you even play it?" The crowd chuckled. Park Seung-ho laughed too, not embarrassed at all. "Me? No. No. I have no musical talent. I bought it because it is beautiful, because it is rare, because owning it means something. But playing it?" He shook his head dramatically. "I would probably break it." More laughter from the guests. "What about you, Min-jae?" Park Seung-ho pointed at a man in glasses. "You took piano lessons as a child, didn't you?" The man called Min-jae held up his hands in surrender. "That was 30 years ago. I can barely remember how to play Happy Birthday." "Soyeon? Didn't your daughter learn piano?" A woman shook her head quickly. "She quit after 6 months. Said it was too hard." Park Seung-ho sighed dramatically. "So, I own one of the most valuable pianos in the country, and no one here can play it. What a tragedy." This got more laughs. The guests were enjoying themselves, enjoying the show their host was putting on. It was entertainment for them, a funny story they would tell at other parties. Junho stood at the edge of the crowd, still holding his delivery bag. He knew he should leave. The kitchen was somewhere behind him. He could drop off the food and go. No one would notice. No one would care, but he couldn't move. His eyes were fixed on the piano, on its black surface, reflecting the lights above, on its keys that seemed to glow white and perfect. His fingers tingled. His heart beat faster. Then Park Seung-ho noticed him. At first, the rich man just glanced at Junho, probably wondering why a delivery boy was standing in the middle of his living room. But then, something shifted in his expression. A spark of mischief. A cruel kind of humor that some people get when they've had too much champagne and want to amuse themselves at someone else's expense. "You there," Park Seung-ho called out, pointing directly at Junho. "Delivery boy." Junho felt his face go hot. Every eye in the room turned to look at him. The wet delivery uniform, the cracked helmet tucked under his arm, the cheap shoes that squeaked on the expensive floor. He had never felt so small in his entire life. "Come here," Park Seung-ho said, waving him over like he was calling a dog. Junho didn't want to go. Every part of him screamed to turn around and run, but his legs moved on their own, carrying him through the crowd until he was standing just a few feet from the piano and the man who owned it. "What's your name?" Park Seung-ho asked. "Kim Junho," he answered quietly. "Kim Junho," the rich man repeated, tasting the name like it was something amusing. "Tell me, Kim Junho, do you know what this is?" He gestured at the piano. The crowd watched silently, sensing that something entertaining was about to happen. "It's a piano," Junho said. "Not just a piano," Park Seung-ho corrected. "It's a Steinway. A 1923 Model D. Worth more than you will probably make in your entire lifetime. Do you understand? Fording the model. Timeline. Fording the model. Fording the model." Junho nodded, even though the words stung. "Have you ever seen anything this valuable before?" Junho shook his head. The crowd laughed softly. Some whispered to each other. A few looked uncomfortable, but no one said anything to stop what was happening. Park Seung-ho leaned closer, his champagne breath warm on Junho's face. "Do you know how to play piano? Delivery boy?" This was the moment. Junho could lie. He could say no, shake his head, and walk away. He could protect the secret he had kept for 5 years. The part of himself he had buried so deep that sometimes he forgot it existed. He could stay invisible, stay safe, stay small, but something inside him wouldn't let him. Maybe it was the way they were all looking at him, like he was nothing, like he was less than nothing. Maybe it was the memory of his parents, who had believed in him so much, who had sacrificed so much to give him a chance. Maybe it was 5 years of silence, 5 years of paper keys and imaginary music, finally demanding to be heard. Or maybe it was just the piano itself, calling to him in a language only he could understand. Yes, Junho said. His voice was quiet but steady. I know how to play. The room went silent for a second. Then Park Seung-ho burst out laughing. You know how to play? He repeated loudly, making sure everyone heard. This boy, this food delivery boy, says he knows how to play the piano. The guests laughed too. Some covered their mouths politely. Others didn't bother hiding their amusement. Tell me, Park Seung-ho said, still laughing. Where did you learn? At a community center? A church? Did you watch YouTube videos on your phone? More laughter. Junho's face burned, but he didn't look away. I learned at the Seoul Arts Academy, he said. The laughter faltered. A few guests exchanged confused looks. The Seoul Arts Academy was one of the most prestigious music schools in the country. Only the most talented children were accepted. And even then, most couldn't afford the tuition. Park Seung-ho raised an eyebrow. The Seoul Arts Academy? You? Junho said nothing. He just stood there, holding his delivery bag, meeting the rich man's eyes. For a moment, something flickered across Park Seung-ho's face. Doubt, maybe. Or curiosity. But then, the champagne confidence returned, and he smiled his wide, perfect smile. All right then, he announced to the crowd. Let's have some fun. He turned back to Junho and spread his arms wide. Play this piano, delivery boy. Play it right here, right now, in front of all these people. Gasps from the crowd. 100 million won was a fortune. It was life-changing money. It was impossible money for someone like Junho. But, Park Seung-ho added, holding up a finger, if you can't play, if you embarrass yourself, you leave. Immediately. And you never deliver to this building again. Deal? The crowd watched eagerly, waiting for the delivery boy to back down, to admit he had been lying, to slink away in shame like they expected him to. But Junho didn't back down. He set his delivery bag on the floor. He placed his cracked helmet beside it. He wiped his wet hands on his uniform, leaving damp streaks on the cheap fabric. And then, without saying a word, he walked to the piano and sat down on the bench. The room fell completely silent. Even the waiters stopped moving. Everyone watched as the delivery boy placed his fingers on the keys of a piano worth more than most of their homes. Junho closed his eyes. He took a deep breath, and somewhere in the back of his mind, he heard his mother's voice, gentle and warm, saying the words she always said before he performed. Play from your heart, my son. Let the music speak for you. He pressed the first key. The first note rang out clear and pure, filling the room like a drop of water falling into a still pond. It was just one note, but something about it made people stop breathing. There was weight in that single sound, a promise of something more to come. Junho kept his eyes closed. He didn't want to see their faces. He didn't want to think about where he was, or who was watching. He needed to go somewhere else. Somewhere deep inside himself, where the music lived, where it had been waiting patiently for 5 long years. He began to play. The piece was Chopin's Ballade No. 1-inch G minor. It was not a song for beginners. It was not something you learned in a few months of lessons. This was a piece that professional pianists practiced for years before performing. It was full of technical challenges, rapid passages, emotional shifts that required not just skill but understanding. It was the kind of music that separated those who played piano from those who truly understood it. Junho had learned this piece when he was 11 years old. His teacher at the academy had told him he was too young, that he should wait, that his hands were not big enough and his heart was not mature enough to handle such complex emotions. But Junho had begged. He had practiced in secret, staying late in the practice rooms, working through the difficult sections again and again until his fingers ached. When he finally performed it at a student recital, his teacher had cried. Not from sadness, but from the shock of seeing something extraordinary in someone so young. Now, 6 years later, in a stranger's penthouse, wearing a wet delivery uniform, Junho played it again. The opening section flowed out of him like water finding its natural path downhill. His fingers moved across the keys with a certainty that surprised even himself. He had worried that 5 years without a real piano would have stolen his ability, that his muscles would have forgotten, that his hands would fail him when he needed them most. But they didn't fail. If anything, they seemed stronger, more sure, more hungry for this moment. The guests stood frozen. The whispers had stopped. The champagne glasses hung motionless in perfectly manicured hands. Even Park Sung-ho, who had been smiling with cruel amusement just moments before, now stood with his mouth slightly open, his expression shifting from disbelief to something harder to name. Junho moved into the second section of the piece, where the melody became more passionate, more urgent. His body swayed slightly with the rhythm. His fingers danced over the black and white keys, striking them with precision and feeling in equal measure. The piano responded to him, like it had been waiting for someone who could speak its language. In his mind, Junho was not in the penthouse anymore. He was back in Seoul, in the small apartment where he grew up. His mother was sitting beside him on the piano bench, her perfume soft and familiar, her hands guiding his. His father was in the doorway, pretending to read a newspaper but actually watching with pride that he could never quite hide. Those days felt like a dream now. A beautiful dream that ended too suddenly, too cruelly, on a rainy night, much like this one. The accident had happened when Junho was 12. His parents were driving home from a concert, one of his concerts, where he had won first place in a regional competition. They had called him from the car, voices full of joy, telling him how proud they were, how much they loved him, how they would celebrate with his favorite meal when they got home. They never got home. A truck driver had fallen asleep at the wheel. The collision was instant. The police said his parents probably didn't feel any pain. Junho never knew if that was true or if they just said it to make a child feel better. After the funeral, Junho went to live with his grandmother in Busan. She was kind and loving, but she was also old and poor. There was no money for piano lessons. There was no money for a piano. There was barely enough money for food and rent and medicine. Junho had to grow up fast. He got a part-time job as soon as he was old enough. He stopped talking about music. He stopped dreaming about concert halls and competitions. He told himself that part of his life was over, that he needed to be practical, that dreaming was a luxury he could no longer afford. But he never stopped practicing. Every night, after his grandmother went to sleep, Junho would sit at his small desk with a piece of paper. On that paper, he had drawn piano keys, all 88 of them, carefully measured and labeled. He would place his fingers on the paper and play silently, hearing the music only in his head, feeling the notes only in his imagination. His grandmother caught him once. She stood in the doorway of his tiny room, watching him play his paper piano, and she cried. The next day, she tried to sell her wedding ring to buy him a keyboard. Junho refused. He told her the paper was enough. He told her he didn't need a real piano anymore. That was a lie. He needed it more than he needed air. But he loved his grandmother more than he loved music, and he would never let her sacrifice for his dreams. Now, after 5 years of paper keys and silent practice, he was finally playing a real piano again. And not just any piano. A Steinway. A 1923 Model D. One of the finest instruments ever made. The music swelled as Junho reached the climax of the piece. His fingers flew across the keys in rapid arpeggios that would make most pianists stumble. But he didn't stumble. Every note was perfect. Every phrase was shaped with intention and emotion. The piano sang under his hands, like it had finally found its voice. Tears were falling now. Not from Junho, whose eyes remained closed in concentration, but from the guests. The woman in the red dress who had laughed about Park Sung-ho not being able to play was wiping her cheeks with the back of her hand. A businessman in an expensive suit was blinking rapidly, trying to hide the moisture in his eyes. Even the waiters had stopped to listen. Trays balanced on their hands, faces soft with wonder. This was what music could do. It could reach past the walls people built around themselves. It could touch something deep and true and human that money and status and success could never reach. Junho played the final section of the ballade, the part where the storm of emotions finally settles into something quiet and resolved. His fingers slowed. The notes became gentler, more tender. It was like watching a fire burn down to glowing embers, still warm, still alive, but peaceful now. The last note faded into silence. Junho kept his hands on the keys for a moment, unwilling to break the connection. Then, he slowly opened his eyes. The room was completely still. No one clapped. No one spoke. They just stared at him, like they had witnessed something they couldn't quite understand. Park Sung-ho's face had changed completely. The arrogance was gone. The cruel humor was gone. In its place was something raw and unguarded, something that looked almost like shame. The silence stretched on for what felt like forever. Then, from somewhere in the back of the room, someone started to clap. It was slow at first, hesitant, like they weren't sure if it was allowed. But then, another person joined, and another, and suddenly the entire room erupted in applause. People were cheering. Some were crying openly now, not bothering to hide it. They clapped until their hands must have hurt, trying to express something that words could not capture. Junho sat on the piano bench, still in his wet uniform, still just a delivery boy. But in that moment, he was something more. He was the boy who had lost everything and kept the music alive anyway. He was the boy who practiced on paper keys and dreamed of impossible things. He was the boy who had just reminded a room full of rich people what it meant to feel something real. Park Sung-ho stepped forward slowly, his expensive shoes making no sound on the wooden floor. He stopped in front of the piano and looked at Junho with an expression that was hard to read. Then he did something no one in that room expected. He bowed. The bow lasted only a few seconds, but it changed everything. A man like Park Sung-ho did not bow to anyone. He was the one who received bows, who accepted respect from others, who stood at the top while everyone else looked up. But here he was, bending at the waist in front of a 17-year-old delivery boy, in front of all his wealthy friends and business partners. When he straightened up, his eyes were wet. He blinked a few times, trying to compose himself. But his voice still cracked when he spoke. "Who are you?" he asked quietly. It was a simple question, but it carried so much weight. He wasn't asking for a name. He already knew Junho's name. He was asking something deeper. How could someone like you play like that? Where did you come from? What is your story? Junho stood up slowly from the piano bench. His legs felt weak, like they might give out at any moment. The adrenaline that had carried him through the performance was fading, and he was suddenly very aware of his wet clothes, his cheap shoes, the delivery bag still sitting on the floor where he had left it. "I'm just a delivery boy," he said. Park Sung-ho shook his head. That was... He paused, searching for words that seemed to escape him. That was the most beautiful thing I have ever heard in my life. And I have been to concerts all over the world. Vienna, Paris, New York. I have heard the greatest pianists alive. But I have never felt what I just felt. The crowd murmured in agreement. People were still wiping their eyes. Some were looking at Junho like he was a completely different person than the one who had walked in with a food delivery just minutes ago. "Please," Park Sung-ho said, and there was something almost desperate in his voice. "Tell me who you really are. Tell me your story." Junho hesitated. He had kept this secret for so long. He had buried it so deep that sometimes he forgot it was there. Talking about it meant opening wounds that had never fully healed. It meant remembering things he had trained himself to forget. But something about this moment, something about the way these strangers were looking at him with genuine curiosity instead of judgment, made him want to speak. So he did. He told them about his childhood in Seoul, about his mother, who was a music teacher, and his father, who worked long hours at a factory but never missed a single one of his performances, about how they discovered he had a gift when he was only 4 years old, picking out melodies on a toy keyboard that his parents had bought at a street market. He told them about the Seoul Arts Academy, where he earned a full scholarship because his family could never have afforded the tuition, about the hours of practice, the competitions, the teachers who pushed him to be better, the dreams of one day playing on the great stages of the world. He told them about the night everything changed. The rainy night, so much like tonight, when a phone call destroyed his entire world. The funeral, where he couldn't cry. The move to Busan, the grandmother who took him in with open arms even though she could barely take care of herself. He told them about the paper piano, about drawing the keys carefully, measuring them to be exactly the right size, and practicing silently every night while the rest of the world slept, about keeping the music alive in his head even when he couldn't make it real. When he finished, the room was silent again. But it was a different kind of silence than before. This was the silence of people who had been moved, who had heard something that touched them in a place they didn't know they had. Park Seung-ho reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his phone. He typed something quickly, his fingers moving with purpose. Then, he looked back at Junho. "I made you a promise," he said. "I told you that if you could play, I would give you 100 million won. And I am a man who keeps his promises." He turned his phone around so Junho could see the screen. It was a banking app, showing a transfer confirmation. 100 million won, sent to a holding account, ready to be claimed. Junho's heart stopped. 100 million won. It was enough to pay off his grandmother's debts, enough to move her to a better apartment, enough to buy her medicine, good food, warm clothes for the winter, enough to change their lives completely. "I can't accept that," Junho heard himself say. The words surprised him as much as they surprised everyone else. Park Seung-ho frowned in confusion. "What do you mean you can't accept it? I offered it. You earned it. It's yours." Junho shook his head slowly. "You offered it as a joke. You didn't really mean it. You were trying to embarrass me." He paused, choosing his next words carefully. "I didn't play for money. I played because I needed to. Because the music was trapped inside me, and I had to let it out. Taking your money would make it feel like a transaction. Like I performed for payment. That's not what this was." Park Seung-ho stared at him for a long moment. Then, unexpectedly, he laughed. But it wasn't the cruel laugh from before. This was something warmer, something almost admiring. "You really are something else," he said. "Most people would take the money and run. But you..." He shook his head in disbelief. "You have more pride than anyone I've ever met." He put his phone away and took a step closer to Junho. "All right, forget the money for now. Let me ask you something else. What do you want? Not money. What do you really want? If you could have anything in the world, what would it be?" Junho didn't have to think about the answer. It came immediately, from somewhere deep inside him. "I want to play again," he said. "I want to learn again. I want to be the pianist my parents believed I could be. But that's impossible. Good teachers cost money. Music school costs money. Everything costs money. And I have none." Park Seung-ho nodded slowly, like he was solving a puzzle in his head. "What if I told you," he said carefully, "that money doesn't have to be a problem?" Junho frowned. "What do you mean?" "I mean that I am on the board of the Korean National Symphony. I am a patron of several music programs across the country. I have connections at every major conservatory in Korea, including Seoul National University. He paused to let this sink in. I know people who would give anything to teach a talent like yours. I know programs that would offer you a full scholarship just based on what I witnessed tonight. Junho felt dizzy. This couldn't be real. Things like this didn't happen to people like him. Dreams didn't come true for delivery boys from tiny apartments in Busan. Why would you do that? He asked. Why would you help me? You don't even know me. Park Seung-ho's expression softened. For a moment, he looked almost sad. Because I've spent my whole life collecting beautiful things, he said quietly. Paintings, sculptures, pianos. I buy them, and I own them, and I show them off to my friends, but I never really understood them. I never felt them. He gestured toward the Steinway. That piano has been in my home for a month. I've walked past it 100 times, but it was just an object to me. Just another thing to own. He looked at Junho with something like respect. Tonight, you showed me what it was really for. You showed me what beauty actually means. And that is worth more than any amount of money I could give you. He reached into his jacket again, but this time he pulled out a business card. He held it out to Junho. Take this. Call me tomorrow. We'll talk about your future. He smiled, and for the first time, the smile reached his eyes. I think it's going to be a very bright one. This one. Junho took the card with trembling fingers. He looked down at the embossed letters, and the phone number, and the title that said, Chairman and Founder. This small piece of paper felt heavier than anything he had ever held. Thank you, he whispered. It was all he could manage to say. Park Seung-ho nodded. Then he turned to address his guests, who had been watching this entire exchange in stunned silence. Ladies and gentlemen, he announced, I think the party is over. I have a phone call to make. Several phone calls, actually. He glanced back at Junho and smiled. I have a young man's future to arrange. 3 years passed like a dream that Junho was afraid to wake up from. The day after the party, he called the number on the business card. His fingers shook so badly that he had to dial 3 times before getting it right. Part of him expected no one to answer, or for Park Seung-ho to have forgotten about him, to laugh and say it was all a joke. Rich people made promises all the time. They rarely kept them, but Park Seung-ho answered on the second ring, and he had already made 5 phone calls that morning on Junho's behalf. Within a week, Junho had an audition at Seoul National University's College of Music. He took a bus to Seoul, wearing the nicest clothes he owned, which were still not very nice at all. His grandmother had ironed his shirt 3 times and packed him food for the journey even though he told her not to worry. The audition room was intimidating. 3 professors sat behind a long table, their faces serious and unreadable. A grand piano waited in the center of the room, its lid open, like a challenge. Junho's hands were sweating. His heart was pounding. For a moment, he forgot everything he had ever learned. Then he sat down at the piano, and everything else disappeared. He played Chopin's Ballade. No. 1 again. The same piece that had changed his life in Park Seung-ho's penthouse. But this time, he played it differently. He played it with hope instead of desperation. He played it with gratitude instead of grief. He played it like someone who had been given a second chance and was determined not to waste it. When he finished, one of the professors was crying. Another one stood up and left the room without saying a word. The third one just stared at him for a long moment before finally speaking. Where have you been hiding? She asked. Junho got the scholarship. Full tuition, room and board, everything covered. He would later learn that it was the fastest admission decision in the program's history. The professors had argued about many things over the years, but they all agreed on one thing that day. This boy was special. Moving to Seoul was hard. Junho had never lived away from his grandmother before. The night before he left, She cooked his favorite meal and pretended she wasn't crying. He pretended he didn't notice. They sat together in their tiny apartment, eating in silence, both of them thinking about how much things were about to change. "Your parents would be so proud," his grandmother said finally. Her voice was steady, but her hands trembled around her chopsticks. "They always knew you were meant for great things." Junho reached across the table and held her hand. It felt so small and fragile, like a bird that might fly away at any moment. "I'll come back," he promised. "Every chance I get. And someday, I'll bring you to Seoul. You'll live in a nice apartment, with a big window, and a view of the mountains. I promise." His grandmother smiled. And for a moment she looked like the young woman in the old photographs. The one who had raised his father, and then raised him too, when there was no one else left. "Just play your music," she said. "That's all I need. Just knowing you're playing again is enough for me." The years at university were the hardest and happiest of Junho's life. He practiced for 8 hours a day, sometimes more. His teachers pushed him to his limits, and then beyond. There were moments when he wanted to give up, when his fingers ached and his mind was exhausted, and he wondered if he was good enough to be here among all these talented people from wealthy families with years of proper training. But every time he felt like quitting, he thought about the paper piano. He thought about all those nights sitting at his desk, pressing his fingers against drawn keys, hearing music that only existed in his imagination. If he could survive that, he could survive anything. He also thought about Park Seung-ho, who came to visit him twice a year. The wealthy businessman had become something unexpected in Junho's life. Not quite a father figure, but something close. A mentor, maybe. A friend. Someone who believed in him when he had stopped believing in himself. During one visit, Park Seung-ho told Junho something he never forgot. "I've given money to hundreds of people over the years," he said. "Artists, musicians, students. Most of them thanked me. And then I never heard from them again. But you're different. You never asked me for anything. You never expected anything. You just worked harder than anyone I've ever seen." He paused and smiled. "That's why I know you're going to make it. Not because of your talent, because of who you are." See, in his 3rd year of university, Junho entered the International Chopin Piano Competition in Warsaw, Poland. It was one of the most prestigious piano competitions in the world. Thousands of pianists applied. Only 40 were selected to compete. Junho was the youngest Korean competitor in 20 years. The competition lasted 3 weeks. 3 weeks of performances, eliminations, pressure that would break most people. Junho watched other competitors crack under the stress. Some cried backstage. Others played brilliantly in practice and then froze on stage. The weight of expectations crushed them, but Junho had carried weight his whole life. The weight of grief, the weight of poverty, the weight of dreams that seemed impossible. Compared to all that, a piano competition was nothing. He made it to the finals. Only 10 pianists remained. The best young talents from around the world. The final round was held in the Warsaw Philharmonic Concert Hall, a beautiful old building with golden walls and perfect acoustics. The audience was filled with music critics, famous pianists, journalists from every major publication. And in the 3rd row, wearing a new dress that Junho had bought her with his first concert earnings, sat his grandmother. She had never been on an airplane before. She had never left Korea before. When Junho surprised her with the ticket, she cried for an hour and then spent the next week worrying about what to pack. He had to convince her that she didn't need to bring food for the journey, that airplanes actually served meals, that Poland was safe and people were kind everywhere in the world. Now she sat in the audience, looking small and a little overwhelmed, but her eyes were shining with pride. Junho spotted her the moment he walked on stage. She waved at him. Just a tiny wave that no one else probably noticed. But he noticed. And it was all the courage he needed. He played 3 pieces that night. He played with everything he had learned, everything he had suffered and survived and hoped for. The music poured out of him like it had been waiting his whole life for this moment. When he struck the final chord, the audience rose to their feet before the sound had even faded. They applauded for 5 minutes straight. Junho won 3rd place. The bronze medal. It was the highest placement by a Korean pianist at the Chopin competition in over a decade. But the medal wasn't what mattered. What mattered was the moment after the ceremony, when he walked into the audience and found his grandmother. She was crying, unable to speak, holding his bronze medal like it was made of real gold. He knelt down beside her and hugged her, right there in front of everyone. And he didn't care who was watching. "Thank you," he whispered in her ear. "Thank you for never giving up on me." She held his face in her hands, the same hands that had fed him and clothed him and worked until they ached so he could have a chance at life. "Your parents are watching," she said. "I know they are. And they are so, so proud." Today, Kim Junho performs on stages around the world. London, New York, Tokyo, Vienna. He has played for presidents and kings and sold out concert halls where people pay hundreds of dollars just to hear him. But once a year, he returns to Busan. He visits the tiny apartment where he grew up, which he keeps exactly as it was, even though he could afford to buy the whole building now. He visits his parents' grave and tells them about his year, about the concerts and the travels and the music. And every year, on the anniversary of the night that changed his life, he visits Park Sung-ho's penthouse. He sits at the same Steinway piano, the 1923 Model D, and he plays. Not for money. He plays because the music was always inside him, waiting to be heard. He plays because a cruel joke became a miracle. He plays because sometimes life gives you exactly what you need at exactly the right moment. And he plays because somewhere, he knows, his mother and father are listening. They always were.